Well done. You have successfully tackled the basic principles of classic management theory. Now, in Module 2, we move on to a new school of theory, Neoclassicism. This is your Module 2 Management Theory Introduction. The leadership approach discussed in Module 2, Neoclassicism, is commonly viewed as an extension of classicism, but with a much broader form. Whereas classical theory sees workers as parts of the machine, so to speak, Neoclassicism incorporates a more human element. While classical management theory proclaims there is one sole management structure to achieve efficiency, Neoclassical management theory addresses the need to examine social dimensions of organizational life. In other words, neoclassicists, unlike classicists, don't see workers as mere performers of strictly defined tasks. They see workers as human beings whose performance ebbs and flows based on not just their skill sets, but also their attitudes, feelings, and relational concerns. The more salient features of neoclassical management theory are: an organization is a social system. An organization is subject to a sediments of its employees. Employees are valuable resources, not tools. Management application should be a democratic, not autocratic process. The primary theories that comprise neoclassicism, which are fluid and can overlap, are participatory management theory, human relations theory, motivational theory. The pioneers who prompted the neoclassical management movement are Elton Mayo with his famous Hawthorne studies and Mary Parker Follett, the lesser known but also revolutionizing theorist with her philosophy of pragmatism. Now, neoclassicist management theory can be broken into different subcategories. These categories or sub-theories may overlap, and some theories go by more than one name. For example, the participatory approach is sometimes grouped together within the human relations discipline. But for purposes of clarity and distinction, in this module, we will separate participatory management theory, human relations theory, and motivational theory into three separate approaches that comprise neoclassicism. We will start with participatory management. Participatory management is the practice of empowering members of a group, such as employees of a company or citizens of a community, to participate in organizational decision-making. The participatory model emphasizes concerns with the delegation of decision-making authority to employees. In theory, the model does much more than recognize that employees ought to be able to recommend changes or course of action, but rather reflect a belief that authority should be transferred to and shared with employees. The belief in this theory stems from understanding what the culture of an organization or institution represents. Conceptually, organizational culture is thought to represent a symbolic and ideal system composed of values and norms implemented by its founders, then shared and reflected to influence behavior of its members or employees in the institution. The culture of the organization or institution is in turn used to guide the meaning of the organization's work. This idea was guided by Mary Parker Follett in the early 20th century. Follett, a social worker and management consultant, was an unconventional thinker. She was not a professional academic, thus she developed her ideas outside of the mainstream academic sphere. Her ideas about organization transcended the corporate model. When Follett spoke about the principles of organization, she was referring to not only business organizations, but also to community. Mary Follett wrote on the giving of orders in the mid-1920s. The importance of her work was the emphasis on the reciprocating reality of giving and taking orders between bosses and subordinates. Unlike the assumption of Weber that rules and role description determined subordinate compliance, Follett argued for a form of participation to ensure acceptance. The personalization of the relationship in the giving of orders also challenged the Taylor assertions of manager-led teams. The notion most central to Follett's conception of organization is the idea of the circular response. The intent of this concept is to capture the ongoing, dynamic, and ever-changing character of the interactions amongst people. The term circular response is a rather sophisticated conception of the communication process. In developing this notion, Follett is interested not in the senders and receivers of communication, but rather the process of relating. A number of important concepts emerge out of Follett's notion, which we will now refer to as participatory theory of the circular response. Participatory theory distinguishes three different ways of dealing with conflict in organizational life. The first is through domination, where the interests and goals of one person are simply asserted over another. The second way of dealing with conflict is through compromise. Here, both parties give up something in order to resolve the situation. Third is a form of conflict resolution referred to as integration. Integration involves finding a solution to a conflict in which neither side has to make a compromise. The best way to achieve integration is through creative engagement via the circular response, where each party involved makes all differences explicit. In participatory management theory, there are two forms of power: power over and power with. Power over reflects the normal exercise of power in which managers simply assert their power over their employees. Power with, to use Follett's own words, a jointly developed power, a coactive, not a coercive power. The ideals of participatory management have been implemented in several different industries and sectors, both successfully and unsuccessfully. One such shift in management styles was studied in a public hospital in Alberta, Canada in 2009. The hospital implemented a care transformation initiative that focused on eliminating wasteful activities and actions and applying an atmosphere of participatory management. This initiative was only implemented in one of the programs in the hospital. That program was studied along with another program in which the initiative was not implemented. The main findings of the study showed that, first of all, organizational change is difficult and takes time. Some workers, particularly older ones, were resistant to the change. The management and clinical staff reported little understanding of their specific contribution to organizational decisions. Despite these challenges, staff only reported feeling optimism that this organizational change may lead to better change in the future. The idea behind participatory theory is that employee involvement occurs at every stage of decision making. From the perspective of participatory theorists, open and honest communication always produces good results, both for organization as well as workers. Freedom and transparency in companies' operations take it to the next level and strengthens the basis of the organization. Toyota is an example of a company that has embraced the participatory management approach. The company has been following suggestion schemes and employee involvement procedures for over a decade now. The management receives almost 2 million suggestions and ideas every year, and around 95% of these are implemented by the company. Who is not aware of Toyota's success rate? Around 5,000 improvements per year have made Toyota one of the fastest growing organizations globally. The need is to develop and implement a comprehensive company policy, and everything works well. British Airways is another great example of participatory management. During economic downsizing, employees' suggestions helped them cut annual costs of their operations by £4.5 million. The company would have suffered from huge losses had it not adopted employees' suggestions. It is right to some extent that employees can misuse industrial democracy, but with a proper management of HR functions, this problem can be solved and the operations of organization can be taken to the next level. Another school of thought within neoclassical theory is the human relations approach, also known as the human relations movement. The human relations approach recognizes that human beings do not always react rationally in terms of rewards. There is a conflict of goals between that of the company and that of the employee, and this needs to be reconciled. A good manager recognizes that every formal organization contains informal sub-organizations in which employees interact. Psychosocial factors at work influence employee behavior, and familiarity with these factors equips managers with the ability to predict staff actions. Elton Mayo is known as the founder of the human relations movement. Mayo, a psychologist, industrial researcher, and organizational theorist, perceived the workplace as an opportunity for personal and social identity. Unlike the classical theories, which put forth good management as a formal practice, the human relations theory emphasizes the importance of informal communication processes for organizational effectiveness. In his early work on industrial relations, Mayo argued that the experience of the average worker in industry ran parallel to the experience of post-traumatic stress victims during World War I. In other words, in Mayo's mind, the workplace produced an extreme sense of alienation in the worker, leading to detachment from the work environment. Mayo saw the workplace as the primary medium for the creation of human identity. However, Mayo argued that the industrial process had destroyed the tight social bonds between workers, thus alienating workers from the social world. For Mayo, the development of a cooperative system in the industrial workplace had implications for the social system as a whole. Now, we are going to learn about Mayo's most famous work in the human relations movement, the Hawthorne Studies. The Hawthorne Studies were conducted from 1924 to 1933 at the Western Electric Hawthorne plant in Cicero, Illinois. In a progressive series of experiments, the researchers attempted to investigate the importance of a variety of physical, economic, and social variables in terms of their effects on employee behavior and attitudes. The first of the Hawthorne studies was an examination of the effect of lighting on workers and corresponding productivity. Using two groups of workers, the experimental group and the control group, Mayo found that although illumination did not appear to be a factor increasing productivity, what did increase productivity was the workers' psychological awareness of being studied. The subsequent Relay Assembly Test Room, RATR studies, was the breakthrough into human relations theory. In this experiment, 5 workers were separated from the rest of the workforce and set to work in a special test room. The 5 workers were subject to a number of experimental changes to their work environment, including shorter working hours, more rest pauses, freer and friendlier supervision, and a new wage incentive system. Their output increased by 30% in the first 2 years of the study. The result of the RATR studies is that for the first time, social scientists seem to have established the significance of the human element in the work process. In other words, contrary to the classical management perspective, workers appear to be motivated not merely by economic incentives, called intrinsic motivation, but also by their experience of and attitudes toward the work process itself, called intrinsic motivation. The last study at Hawthorne was one of the earliest examples of qualitative naturalistic research in the workplace. Based on the observation of a group of workers, the goal of the study was to examine the natural development of informal group relations without interference from researchers. The significance of this study lay in its identification of workers as forming social groups to shape their relationship to the work process. There are several implications of the Hawthorne studies, which include discovery of the informal work group, importance of informal communication, the Hawthorne effect, which is essentially the mantras happy worker is a productive worker, use of qualitative methods, and more. The studies also served as an impetus for leadership research. The idea that a happy worker is a productive worker has not gone out of fashion. An example of an organization that tries to integrate employee happiness, customer happiness, and e-commerce is Zappos, an online shoe and clothing shop based in Las Vegas. Zappos' business philosophy is built on the principle of happiness for both customers and employees, and it's working. The company appears regularly on Fortune magazine's list of 100 best companies to work for. Interestingly, the employee incentives are not centered around financial rewards. Salaries are modest, and they do not offer many monetary perks. The uniqueness in Zappos is how it constructs its culture around happiness and weirdness. Potential employees must pass a culture interview in which they are asked questions about their own, quote, weirdness, unquote. They also go through a social situation in which the hiring managers observe how the candidate interacts with others. In classic human relations style, or better put, in neoclassical human relations style, one Zappo employee defines the company's culture as the overall environment, space, attitude, freedom, management style, and actual physical surroundings, which all work together to create a milieu which attempts to make each individual happier, so that each one of us will then spread this to each other, our customers, and everyone we encounter. The years that followed World War II were boom years for the US economy, and in many ways marked the institutionalization of the modern corporate organization. It was around this time that the corporate manager became a dominant figure in the workplace. However, this period of a stable, growing economy and full employment also created a problem from a managerial perspective. While in the early days of capitalism, coercion and threats were enough to motivate employees, but this was no longer the case. Workers were in a more powerful position after World War II than before it. Stable, well-paid employment and strong unionization meant that management could no longer simply use coercion or the threat of firing to motivate workers. Theorist Douglas McGregor recognized this change and correspondingly devised a theory that centers on motivation. In addition to being a theorist, McGregor was a management professor at MIT's Sloan School of Management and author. It was his book, The Human Side of Enterprise, which featured his famous X and Y theories, that established him as significantly influential in the human relations movement. Let's take a look at McGregor's X and Y theories, which serves as the basis for the motivational perspective. In developing a model of work motivation, McGregor, in 1960, explicitly framed his theory in terms of influence and control. He argued that managerial authority at that time was based on an old, outdated model of authority founded primarily on the coercion of employees, and that this technique is problematic. McGregor termed this management control as Theory X. He describes this view in the following ways. 1. The average human being has an inherent dislike of work and will avoid it if he or she can. 2. Because of this, most employees have to be coerced, controlled, directed, and threatened with punishment in order to get them to perform efficiently. And 3. The average human being prefers to be directed, wishes to avoid responsibility, and has relatively little ambition and wants security above all. Mind you, this is the viewpoint, Theory X, that McGregor identified but did not support. He proposes an alternate viewpoint, which he terms Theory Y. Some of his main assumptions are employees take pride in their work and enjoy the challenges it brings. The workplace is an opportunity for human growth. Work becomes motivating and not drudgery, precisely because workers recognize that their higher needs can be realized through the degree of autonomy and responsibility they are given. Managers who supervise according to the Theory Y encourage their workers to develop their skills. Managers who use this approach trust their people to take ownership of their work and do it effectively by themselves. A couple real-life examples of successful Theory Y management applications are Google and Microsoft. Google gives its staff a lot of freedom and makes sure they enjoy their work. Google does not micromanage its employees because leaders prefer their staff to be creative and take ownership of their work. Google gives employees flexibility. It makes sure the workplace is comfortable with everything from chiropractors to cereal bars. It also allows for employees to be creative. Employees are motivated to stay and be productive. Another example of a Theory Y leader is Bill Gates, former CEO of Microsoft. Gates was an example of Theory Y management style. He was at the top of the hierarchy, but below him, there was a large layer of people working for him. With his democratic style of management, he let the workers become more involved in the company's decisions. Nevertheless, at the end, he was going to make the final decision based on what was discussed. Interestingly, his former competitor, Steve Jobs of Apple, was known to have practiced more of a Theory X leadership style. Jobs is described as having been an autocratic and persuasive leader, a typical Theory X manager. He used his charisma and his authority to lead his followers, but he was known as self-centered, emphasizing total control and inducing fear. However, his autocratic leadership style and his perfectionism brought him and Apple to an unimaginable height.